Western culture knows the face in the moon, or the man in the moon, but that's not something that I was ever personally able to picture. However, when I look at clouds or the spots on my wall or on the ceiling, I imagine the weirdest things. There have been plenty of scientific studies into how and as to the reasons why people see recognizable shapes in random patterns. Even looking back to the 1930s, neuroscientists were skeptical about the reliability of the Rorschach ink blot test, along with the issues that could be brought up from assumptions about personalities and mental illness. Pareidolia is a vague, universal tendency among mankind to conceive all beings like themselves and to transfer every object those qualities with which they are familiarly acquainted and of which they are intimately conscious. Hume, 1957. Neuroscientist Joel Voss has been studying the purpose of the human brain's wiring to recognize new images, and the general conclusion he drew was that the brain is a flexible, all-purpose machine meant to succeed in whatever random environment it inhabits. To triumph in strange places, Voss says the brain must be able to quickly process unfamiliar visual stimuli, like new shapes and lines, and figure out what's worth paying attention to. In the case of the moon, cultures all over the world have different ideas about what they saw and still see in the shadows of the moon craters, especially variable when looking from the variety of locations depending on the latitude in the northern and southern hemispheres. I don't picture the man or the face while looking at the northern hemisphere view of the moon, or the woman when I looked from the southern hemisphere while I was in Australia or in New Zealand, partially because I never thought about it. I could kind of see more of a fish, but only if actively trying to see something. And when I showed images of the moon to my mother, she said she could picture a butterfly in the top left shadow, where I can see the fishtail where the rears of a rabbit would be in other cultures. So while I can't see the face on the moon if pressed, I can't picture the rabbit in the moon. And it appears recorded in an interesting mixture of disconnected and connected cultural ideas. But before getting trapped in a different rabbit hole, diving into psychology and neuroscience of vision, that rabbit will pop out and guide us through history and mythology instead. But there's the question, why a rabbit? My name is Renee Whitehouse. You're listening to Detours in Archaeology, and this week we're going to find out who's throwing rabbits at the moon. In the Maya region, the Temple of the Skull was the first incarnation that I had ever seen of the evil Maya bunny, as our archaeological study abroad group called it. While in Palenque, we came to the area with the temple pyramids next to the palace. We had a lecture and proceeded to climb each open one, the ones that were allowed to climb. The Temple of the Skull, next to the closed Temple of Inscriptions, was where the stucco sculptures of the rabbit skulls were seen by a group of 9 archaeology students in 2013, and hundreds of thousands of people after, during, and hundreds of years before us. While the name Palenque is Spanish for palisade, the Spanish didn't name the city, and instead butchered the Nahuatl word Tlaanca, which I probably just butchered as well, meaning decay or putrescence. Even this, however, as a Uto-Aztec language name, wouldn't have been what people living in the late pre-classic to early post-classic Maya periods, roughly 200 to 900 CE, would have called their city. Tzeltal, the language and the group of people who still live today in Chiapas, Mexico, are the descendants of those who built and resided in sites like Palenque and Tikal. Further research and discussion with locals from other scientists had determined that the possible original name of the city of Palenque, Gochan, which compared to the roots of the word gosh or yosh, meaning either empty, unoccupied, wood boar, dry rot, or a conjugate, meaning worm-eaten, all of which could, maybe in a roundabout way, connect to the Nahuatl Mixtec's name of decay. In Yucatec Maya, however, the name for Palenque is Bac, meaning bone or horn, but also Lacamha, which means great waters, which could easily connect to the geographical location of being built right beside a large permanent waterfall. Since the city-state of Bacal is thought to have been abandoned something around 800 CE after the end of the Late Classic, the thought I had was that some of the Bone City usages came up after its peak. But take this with a whole handful of salt because I have zero evidence of this. Since the Maya form of writing was in glyphs, their place names were logically in that representation. There were 4 different variants of the same name glyph, one being some kind of bird, and the other 3 depicting bones, 2 of which are skulls, a brocket deer, or a rabbit. Some academics have said that the deer and the rabbit animal are alter egos that are interchangeable in Mayan folklore, and thus both of the emblem glyphs signify Palenque, although the deer are also thought to carry the sun to the hare's moon. Whatever the name was, or whether it changed over time, the stucco skull is still in place at the top of the Temple of the Skull, otherwise identified as Temple 12 or the Temple of the Dead Moon. The stucco is on the lone remaining front-facing pillar of the Temple of the Skull, which shares the pyramid platform with the Temple of the Red Queen, named for the queen buried beneath. Both of these temples have been dated to the 8th century CE and were built upon hundreds of years of older building layers, with the base being a vault containing elite jade jewelry and some human bone. So, with the little information that we have, it's mainly thought that the relief is either a symbol of Palenque itself, or that it represents a connection to the moon through the goddesses of the moon, one of which is Awelish, who are depicted holding rabbits as pets, causing the rabbit's moon shadow and a symbolic connection to the lunar cycle rituals. Within the Maya area, there were multiple stories of different gods and goddesses being the moon, or at least part of the moon's story. The traditional Maya moon goddess during the classic period was represented in the Quiche's Popol Vuh, written in the 16th century, and the Dresden Codex. And in some versions, her name was either Goddess 1, White Woman, Goddess O, Ishel, the Red Woman, or Awelish, and is sometimes separate from the Lunar Rabbit, who is a trickster character in the classic iconography. In some versions within the Maya area, Goddess 1 was the terrestrial version of the water or moon goddess, who was more so associated with wells, rainfall, or the rainy season, the name of whom we don't actually know. Ishel, or Goddess O, also known as the Red Woman, was a goddess of healing and birthing and was depicted as an old woman or a midwife. Her name likely came from the Yucatec Mayan in the northern part of the Yucatan Peninsula, or the Pokmonchi, part of the Quichean-Pocom language branch of Mayan in many regions of Guatemala, as it was used in both areas. Sometimes conflated with the White Woman or Goddess 1, Ishel is supposed to represent different aspects of the moon, or the interpretation of the moon in various stages of her feminine cycle, which is extremely prominent in the mythos. When written about in codices, the distinction will be made by the appearance of either the glyph for white, sak, or red, chak, before the glyph for woman, ishik. As an extremely short and not at all nuanced summary of why the moon exists in phases from one particular area, the Kepchi myth has Po, the moon goddess, as a daughter of the earth god, and is wooed and captured by the sun, and they sleep together. Whether consensual or not, the pair are discovered by the moon's father, who punishes her, not the sun god, by literally destroying her. A researcher named Brackhaus states that in the mythos, this is likely the origin of female menstruation. It's a punishment on all women because one who may not have even had a choice, but even if she did the sex willingly, it was not a feminist mythological culture. Luckily, for the rest of existence, the evil blood was poured into 13 jars, which ended up transforming into animals, plants, poison, disease, and medicine, with the 13th jar holding the reborn moon herself. In other regions, Ixchel is described as a jaguar-decorated earth and war goddess, connecting more with the Mixtec Tlautecutli, Tosi, and Tzihuacuac, who were all called upon to aid midwives. With these sorts of connections, one Vedapaz myth connects Ixchel with her spouse, Itzmamna, and her 13 sons, and possibly the sweat bath, which was used for purification. Another myth from Oaxaca has Ixchel as an aged mother of the sun and the moon who is imprisoned within the sacred sweat baths to become their patron deity. Neither of these really connects to the moon, and the second has Ixchel interchanged with Skicha, the Oaxacan old adoptive mother, who doesn't actually seem to connect with the sweat baths. Suffice it to say, the mythology and general history of the region at large have been sufficiently twisted, especially if the records were written down in the 16th century, so unfortunately we can't be sure of the original stories. Some studies instead refer to Awelish as the general goddess of the moon and the queen of the night, possibly derived from the Chontal Mayan moon goddess Si Abawil Ish in the classic 200 to 900 CE, and or the Quiche post-classic 900 to 1521 CE. Awelish, and one of her representations as a hare, was portrayed in the Mayan calendar as a symbol of the Ahau of the Quiche capital Umarkaj and the month of Jan, meaning well, as in the moon has gone to her well. This expression is thought to refer to the new moon, which could refer to the number of new moons that will appear in the month, or since she is also associated with one of the Venus years, it could also have to do with the number of eclipses recorded and projected in the Dresden Codex, and by the lunar series on the long count calendar, with her specific calendar day probably being Ik, meaning moon, in the 20-day cycle. Depending on the specific Mayan language, the Quiche, Quechua, and possibly even the Nahuatl sublanguage of Uto-Aztecan, the stories vary more based on the totem animals than what the goddess actually represents. The eagle would be for the lunar aspect and the jaguar for the aspect of night, along with her association to the underworld. Similarly, the swallow, Quilish or Rilish in the Quechua, may have been from where her name, Awelish, was originally derived before her worship spread along with the Popol Vuh. It seems that a common theme for a blood moon is to connect its concept to the mythology of a goddess. From the Quiche Popol Vuh manuscript, there is also the goddess Skik, daughter of Cucumachik, who is one of the lords of Xibalba, and she was sometimes mentioned as Blood Moon, Blood Girl, or Blood Maiden. Long story short, this woman appears in more of a creation/virginal birth myth rather than any specific ties to the moon or to rabbits. These new ties give more peaceful transfer of power to the newly arrived and conquering Christianity, as they can connect virginal birth to the origin myth of the hero twins, who are a staple in many Mesoamerican regions and specific cultures. It's unclear whether the rabbit in images made by Mesoamerican artists, when they are being posed with the gods, is supposed to be identified as the mostly unknown moon goddess. However, it is thought by archaeologists to connect the goddess and god with the function of the moon, to specifically identify it as a lunar rabbit, and, as mentioned previously, is sometimes portrayed in oral stories to be a trickster archetype. This aspect shows up within the mythology from the Maya people of Chiapas and in the northern highlands of Guatemala, wherein the moon is either the sun's mother or grandmother, and the lunar rabbit is either a god or goddess caught and shape-changed by the moon, or is a creature that helped the maize regrow in the sun's field before being taken back to the sky. Ushaklayun Yuba Kawil, who ruled, likely known as 18 Rabbit, was the 13th Ahau, who ruled from around 695 to 738 CE of the powerful Maya polity that contains the site of Copan. or in its classic Mayan, Oshwiklik, located in modern Honduras. Like other rulers, there is an animal component to his name, but so far, archaeologists and historians haven't made any links from the names to anything else. One possible connection, made by me, so probably not at all accurate, is from Stela A and states that Copan ranks with the three other kingdoms, Calakmul, Palenque, and Tikal. The latter two of the three were on the same side, and Palenque, one of the two, houses the stucco rabbit skull. Just like today, there is a ton of political nuance that I am not equipped to get into. I will only wonder out loud, does having the name Rabbit connect this man 18 Rabbit to Palenque in some weird way? I don't know. Although the Mexica have the goddess of the moon, read or listen to my podcast on Coyoxauhqui for more about her. As their storytelling moves away from the goddesses that shape the mythology, they seem to have a stronger connection to the moon itself, rather than the rabbit loosely symbolizing the gods, appearing as a pet or otherwise. There are short tales where the rabbit is more or less the hero, while others have them mainly being an innocent bystander being thrown at stuff. Quetzalcoatl, or just a random man in some versions, was living on Earth and walked on a long journey. But without food or water, he was sure he would die. Then a rabbit, who is grazing nearby, offers to share her food with the tired and hungry Quetzalcoatl, or man. He tells the rabbit he doesn't eat vegetables, so she then offers herself as food. Moved by the rabbit's altruism, Quetzalcoatl, probably more of a god in this version, embeds the rabbit's image on the moon so that the entire world will remember her. Another Mexica myth, and its variations, tell a different version of how the rabbit came to be on the moon, and the part of the god, Mixtec, played in the creation of the fifth sun. If you want to learn more about all the other versions of the sun, look on YouTube for overly sarcastic productions. Though Mixtec and Nanahuatzin vied to be the new sun after the previous one died, Nanahuatzin jumped into a fire first, before being followed by Tetzitzecat. Angry at Mixtec for being too slow, the other Mixtec gods threw a rabbit at him, which left an impression and dimmed Mixtecat's illumination, so as the moon, he could only be seen in the night sky, as the moon. Or, Nanahuatzin, being extremely humble, sacrificed himself in a fire to become the new sun. But Tetzitzecat was too cowardly to jump right into the fire and hesitated 4 times. Because of this, the other gods thought that he shouldn't shine as brightly as the sun and, like in the previous story, threw a rabbit at his face. Or even, when sacrificing himself to become the new moon, Tetzitzecat was in the form of a rabbit and thus he cast his shadow. Probably the nicest version. Or even again, as a translation from the Florentine Codex, the gods were teasing the moon and flung a rabbit, and the rabbit remained marked on the moon's face. That is what darkened the face of the moon, as though it has been bruised, upon which the moon went out to light the world. According to Miller and Taub, in post-classic central Mexico, the rabbit was also closely identified with the intoxicating drink pulque. This association is well documented in the day named Toxtli, meaning rabbit in Nahuatl. The patron of Tocli was Mayahuel, the goddess of maguey, the agave plant, and by extension, its principal product, pulque. Moreover, many pulque gods were known collectively as the Ometotli, a calendar name with the literal meaning to rabbit, which is a specific day, from the classic Nahuatl word for pulque, ochli. From the Codex Borgia, researchers found that the Ometotli is the calendar name of the god Tepoztecat, or Tezantzoctecat, meaning something close to workable metal person or mere 400 person respectively. He is shown as the god of pulque, drunkenness, and fertility, along with his consort, Xochiquetzal, and was one of the Tzantzontotzochin, meaning 400 rabbits. A couple of asides. Whenever 400 is used, it likely means an incalculable number. The base of their mass system was 20, So just like the 400 brothers of Calique, who are the stars, it just means a lot. And pulque is an alcoholic beverage made from the fermented sap of the agave plant, as mentioned. From experience, it tastes a bit like tequila, so it is pretty good. And it looks like very pale green snot, but it tastes much better than it looks. In the UNESCO World Heritage Site, Teotihuacan, there's evidence of cages for breeding rabbits and hares, or as the academic articles call them, cottontails and jackrabbits. They have been examined recently within the past 10 years. The large urban metropolis of Teotihuacan that was built in the center of Mexico is thought to have been established around 100 BCE, with its population height estimated at 125,000 or more from 1 to 500 CE. Then it had its collapse approximately 50 years later when monuments and murals were sacked and systematically burnt. To support such a large population, leporids, cottontails, and jackrabbits were bred and managed by humans for food and for secondary products such as furs. Evidence for this is found in traces of butchering on the leopard bones and within isotope analysis of carbon and nitrogen of many archaeological specimens. These analyses showed that rather than hunting or butchering wild rabbits, the animals were subsisting on the cultivated food of the humans. The oldest cultural group of people that we know of in Mesoamerica flourished during the formative period into the pre-classic, from around 1500 BCE to around 400 BCE, with their central location at San Lorenzo Tenochtitlan in southeastern Veracruz, and growing throughout the Olmec heartland. With their wide range of food options, one of the animals Olmecs hunted was rabbits, the evidence of which has been found in archaeological midden surveys. One piece on display from the Olmec is the rabbit god. The pre-Columbian artworks from Chicayan, Osolluama, and Veracruz are on display in the National Museum of Anthropology in Mexico City. Similar to the rabbit shape of some pulque vessels from the Mixtecs, is a drinking vessel dating back to between 1200 and 1000 BCE from the Olmecs, likely also connecting to the later rabbit god of drunkenness and fertility. The Toltecs were a culture who predated the Mixtec Empire by a few hundred years, being at their height in the post-classic from 800 to 1100 CE. Based in Tula and possibly extending to the Maya city of Chichen Itza, the Mixtec culture would later adopt much of the Toltec culture and glorify their intellectual and cultural predecessors, which led scholars to acknowledge the largely mythical narrative of historic events. In the Codex Borgia's illustration of Tepostecat, the rabbit/pulque god is holding a bent stick, rather than the Mendoza Codex of 1541, in which he is thought to be wielding a copper axe. This seems to make narrative sense because of the Mixtec's mythological view of all things Toltec and shows the roots of their inspiration. This connects to the flat curved sticks, or bent sticks, or rabbit sticks, which are the Mesoamerican non-returning boomerangs found in Chichen Itza, Tula, etc., and are thought to have been used to hunt animals, rabbits included. But these weapons are not restrained to hunting, believed to also have been wielded by Maya and Toltec warriors. Their use also extended up into the American Southwest, into Texas and New Mexico's cultural groups, such as the Puebloans, which have a decent amount of cultural overlap with their southern neighbors. In this particular area, not even growing into the topic of the rest of North or South America, there are multiple gods, goddesses, and creatures in myths who pull together all of the aspects of the moon and rabbits that we can all understand today. The connections in these mythologies make so much regular logical sense that it makes me wonder if archaeologists only came to those conclusions because they make sense from a Western perspective. With a general human perspective looking at the entire region, the cultures were interwoven, and later cultures took inspiration from great kingdoms of the past. Most, if not all, cultures in the world saw that the moon had a monthly lunar cycle, just like women's menstruation. So a woman could be the origin of the moon, and with the woman's obvious connection to fertility, in the general sense, the moon would as well. Then, with the rabbit's young age of fertility, along with their short gestation period, and because of their habitat niche as prey animals, must keep the population numbers high, and they are constantly viewed as a fertility symbol and an easily accessible food source, somewhat like cultivation of maize. When looking at human behavior, it makes sense that rabbits would be connected with the most popular alcoholic beverage of the region at the time, since generally alcohol releases inhibitions, sometimes leading to more babies. Therefore, the connection between the moon goddess and the rabbit companion is hardly unfounded. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Detours in Archaeology called Who's Throwing Rabbits at the Moon? There's so many more legends from around the world that have to do with the moon, with rabbits, really their connection, and the connection with females in general. I did not have the time to flesh this out on this podcast. So just so you know, I did not ignore them. Whether you've heard my episodes before, or if this one is your first, I truly appreciate your time and interest. I would like to apologize for any names or pronunciations I get wrong. I do make hearty attempts, but of course I make mistakes. I really want to learn, so please, if you have any comments, corrections, any questions, or if you have an idea of something for me to delve into, you can comment directly on whatever podcast app you're listening to. Email me directly at detoursinarchaeology@gmail.com, or head over to my website at detoursinarchaeology.com and go to the contact page. I'd especially like to thank my Patreon supporters. If you'd like to join them, head over to my channel's page at patreon.com/detoursinarchaeology. For less than $1 per episode, you can support me. I really would appreciate it. Any support you could give me. And that includes rating and reviewing each episode and the podcast itself, so more people will hear about it, see it on their suggested screens, and maybe I can make this a little bit bigger. You get extra goodies every week, like bloopers, more writing, or photo blogs that are not on my Instagram. You can follow me on Instagram to catch the latest photos at Flying Sepida. Sepida is spelled Sepii. D-A. It is the family name for cuttlefish without the E at the end. And don't forget to sign up for email notifications at my website after you read a bunch of different articles. Every Wednesday, I have either an article or one of my personal illustrations posted, which you can get for yourself at the second level on Patreon. Another way, arguably the best way to support the podcast, at least for right now, is to subscribe, rate, and review, as this can help it reach a wider audience and kind of get the word out to the general public, and maybe inspire some new people. All the music used was by Scott Buckley, who you can find at scottbuckley.com.au. My podcast is now available on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. So here's another fun fact. From the BBC's Science Focus, your brain burns 400 to 500 calories a day, and that's about a fifth of your total energy requirements. Most of it is concerned with the largely automatic process of controlling your muscles and processing sensory input, although some studies show solving tricky problems increases your brain's metabolic requirements too. If you want to know more about how much, like burning calories and metabolic requirements for your body, you can listen to Ali Ward's podcast Ologies. The episode is Dr. Herman Ponser on evolutionary anthropology, focused on metabolism. If you know any true fun facts, please share them with me and I'll relay them to everyone who listens, and you'll get your own shout out. I'll see you soon for another detour into archaeology. As a short aside, the third game of the updated Lara Croft trilogy isn't really a shell, and yes, it is a pretty interesting choice for story and a cool design in general, but I really hope that players will either know the difference or at least that they might look it up. And I will add that I appreciate that they didn't try to make Ishel a malicious or evil character in the story. See you in 2 weeks. Thanks again.